All right, class. All right, class. Y'all, welcome back to my second semester star review video. The two reasons you would be watching this video are one, you're preparing for the star test at the end of the year. Good luck, and remember, this is the one and last hurdle we need to accomplish for the year. Or you are preparing for the final exam. If so, prepare yourself the best you can, and good luck and enjoy your summer vacation. Now, what we need to remember is that our second semester began with World War II. I want to remind you that there are many causes to this war, many things that lead us into the Second World War. One of the major things is, if we remember, the Treaty of Versailles. This was the treaty that ended World War I, and it was so unfair towards Germany that they were willing to start a Second World War. The other major thing is that we were just experiencing a worldwide economic depression. In the United States, we called it the Great Depression, but remember, this wasn't just a problem for the United States, this was a worldwide economic depression. Now, the final and most major reason that we get a Second World War is we get the rise of these men and leaders like them. Remember, we call these leaders dictators. These aren't presidents, these aren't prime ministers like in England. These men have absolute power, control, and authority, and they rule their country with fear and violence. Now, remember, just like in World War One, in World War Two, America tried to stay out of the fighting. We tried to say that we wouldn't participate, and we tried to practice isolationism. Unfortunately, we get drawn into this conflict. Now, the thing that draws America into the war is the attack at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Our naval base there is bombed by the Japanese, and this surprise attack on a peaceful nation who was not at war draws America's anger and brings America into the fighting. Not only that, America then issues an executive order called Executive Order 9066, ordering more than 100,000 Japanese Americans into prison camps called internment camps. Y'all, this is a dark and disturbing part of the American history, and y'all, you've heard me say it before, when our country is afraid of something, we make awful choices. Now, in the fighting of World War II, we probably won't have to cover many battles, but the most famous is known as D-Day. This is where we decide to land onto the shores of Europe in what is called the invasion of Normandy. This is where we land on the beaches of France at the five landing sites of Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Now, it's not just American forces that land on the beaches of Normandy, France. It'll also be British and Canadian troops as well. The man commanding our troops on D-Day is Dwight D. Eisenhower, who we all know will one day become president of the United States. Now, during the fighting against the Japanese, we're going to use a group of soldiers known as Navajo Code Talkers. These Navajo Native Americans are going to send our secret messages for us because only people on Earth that speak the Navajo native language are members of the Navajo tribe, making this an unbreakable code. Another group of fighters that you should recognize from World War II are called the Tuskegee Airmen. These were a group of all black fighter pilots during World War II who were highly decorated for their performance and duty. Remember, African American soldiers will serve in this war in segregated units. Now, our strategy for fighting Japan out in the Pacific is called island hopping. As it demonstrates in the photos here, we kind of hop island to island. The goal is to get as close to Japan as possible until we can are so close that we can eventually bomb them from the air. As we all know, how the war eventually ends in Europe is Hitler commits suicide, but probably the question you will see on your test is how the war ends in Japan. Remember, we get so close to Japan, we eventually bomb them from the air. When they refuse to surrender after we firebomb their cities with explosive bombings, we end up using the atomic bomb. Remember, y'all, it is the project known as the Manhattan Project that produces that weapon and eventually the use of the atomic bombs will force Japan to surrender. Then we enter what is called the Cold War. The Soviet Union goes from an ally in World War II to our number one fear and our number one enemy. We've got to remember, we've been afraid of communism and the Soviet Union for a while. Now, when you think of the Cold War, you think of it as democracy versus communism. It is basically a fight for the entire fate of the world. Will the world be communist? Will the world be a democracy? Now, our goal when dealing with communism is containment, keep it from spreading. The idea is if it spreads into one country, it is very likely to spread into another, and then another, and then another. Now, two of the ways we try and go about stopping the spread of communism are called the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine. Now, the Marshall Plan, to put it simply, provide economic aid. Money for Marshall Plan. We will give you money as long as you do not fall into the hands of communism. We'll help you build support of your country. We'll help you develop your country. We'll even give you military support and money to provide for weaponry as long as you use it to stop communism from spreading into your country. And the Truman Doctrine, we will send military aid to stop the spread of communism. This will give us reasonings to go into the wars in Korea and in Vietnam. Now, you might think, why didn't the Soviet Union and the United States just fight things out in the first place? Why didn't we just start an all-out war? It is because of what is called mutually assured destruction. The United States and the Soviet Union have huge or nuclear arsenals. It started out as atomic bombs, which then eventually made way for nuclear and hydrogen bombs, which are so deadly that they could kill just about every human on Earth if all of them were deployed. Now, countries all over the world have to decide what team to be on team democracy or team communism. Team democracy is called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, when you join NATO, the point is you join it for protection. You know that if you get attacked by communism, the United States, England, and all the other NATO members are going to jump in and have your back. So, kind of as we see in the funny picture here, the US and the UK are protecting the rest of NATO. Now, one of the first opening moments of this Cold War happens around the city of Berlin. What we need to remember is that at the end of World War II, the Soviets got to Berlin first. Now, we had an agreement to divide the city of Berlin in half and the country of Germany itself. The problem is, the city of Berlin is located on the Soviet side. So anytime we had to do business in our part of the capital city of Berlin, we had to drive supplies in and out very strictly under monitor across the border into Soviet territory. Now, when the Soviet Union cuts off our ability to enter by truck and by road, we have to fly supplies in. It is called the Berlin Airlift. It goes on for a period of time, then it becomes embarrassing for the Soviet Union to have American planes dropping supplies all over their city, that they eventually open up the borders and allow us to drive our supplies in. Now, one of the first conflicts of warfare that we see of the Cold War is called the Korean War. If you remember, it started out with communism in the north, democracy in the south, and divided in the middle of what's called the 38th parallel. Then communism from the north invades the south. That's this first picture here. America then arrives and to defend democracy and pushes back even into North Korea. When it looks like the war's about to be over, China joins the fight, because remember, communism has taken over China. It becomes what is known as a stalemate, where no one's winning, no one's losing, and a final armistice is decided where the war just simply hits pause. They continued this war into the 21st century with a very delicate truce. The line that divides this country today is called the DMZ. Now, another major moment from this Cold War is called the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba has been developing nuclear missile sites. When it is identified by American spy planes that these sites are becoming available, we decide to act. Our president doesn't want to take too aggressive an action, but he also can't look weak, so he does what's called a naval quarantine. He surrounds Cuba with the Navy so that no more missile supplies can get into the country, and he starts negotiating with the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev and Kennedy, these two men talk for 13 or 14 straight days until finally an agreement is made. Nuclear missiles will be taken away from Cuba. Nuclear missile capabilities will be taken away from Turkey. And America agrees never to invade Cuba ever again. Now, we're not just dealing with communism on an international level. We're afraid of communism here in America. We're afraid of communist spies. And what makes this fear so much worse and so much blown out of proportion is this man, Joseph R. McCarthy. We begin to know this time period as McCarthyism. He is the boy who cried communist. He simply points his finger at everybody he can, especially people within the own US government, and says, "You're a communist and you're a communist." When it turns out he has no proof at all, and this was just kind of a big, blown out of proportion scare tactic, this becomes known not just as the Red Scare, which is our fear of communism, but McCarthyism, this time period where people are investigated and blamed. Now, another portion of the Cold War that goes on for decades, as we know, is called the space race. America and the Soviet Union are competing to see who can explore outer space the best. Now, the space race has many moments in it. Probably the most famous is when the Soviet Union launches Sputnik 1. Remember, this is the first man-made object and the first satellite launched into space. When the United States realizes that the Soviet Union has done this and that they're so far behind, they create the program known as NASA and begin their own scientific development. Now, the Soviet Union will do a lot of things first in the space race, but America will be the first to land a man on the moon. This accomplishment is what gives America the ability or the reasoning to say they won and were victorious in the space race. And because of that, um, the long-lasting effects are that our continued space program today. And here's the biggest thing to remember. All the technology we get, the satellites, the internet, the microwave ovens, the Velcro, the things that you don't even think about, like GPS and Find My iPhone app, these are all evolutions and consequences, benefits that we get because of the space race. Now, probably the most famous conflict of the Cold War is the Vietnam War. If you don't remember, this was a brutal conflict that goes on for quite some time during the 1960s and the 1970s. Now, America is going to deploy troops to Vietnam for much of the same reasons they did in Korea. They have a very delicate truce in Vietnam. The north of Vietnam is communist, the south of Vietnam is democracy, but it is looking more and more like the whole country is going to fall into communism. That is when America begins escalating and sending troops into Vietnam. Now, one interesting thing to note is that President Kennedy didn't want to send troops into Vietnam, but we all know what happened to him. It will be his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, that sends the troops into Vietnam. Now, this is a brutal war that scars many of the people involved in it, and it gets nicknamed the Living Room War, meaning it impacts America's society in a way that other wars simply did not have the same impact. Y'all, it is called the Living Room War because there is more camera coverage of this war than any other war in American history. If you remember, this created what's called a credibility gap. Basically, people started to doubt the official statements because what they saw on the TV screens didn't match what the government was saying about how the war was going. Now, remember, back home in America, people are protesting this war all the time. The thing they're truly protesting is the draft. Now, one major change they get because of all of this anti-war protesting, especially surrounding the draft and the hatred and the wanting to ending of the war, is they get the 26th Amendment. This lowers the voting age from 21 down to 18. And I think, just like the button says, it's very self-explanatory how this connects to the Vietnam War. If you can fight and die for your country, you should be able to vote for who's president of your country. Now, we need to de-escalate and end the Vietnam War, but also start de-escalating the Cold War in general. That is what Richard Nixon is going to be kind of rightly known for. He pulls our troops out of Vietnam and he does what's called ping pong diplomacy. He visits the country of China and the Soviet Union, and he also helps us bond with that country over the sport of ping pong. Now, when we talk about the ending of the Cold War, I'm kind of fast forwarding to the end of the 1980s, early 1990s. We're talking about the bringing down of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union, this giant thing that had taken on satellite nations and taken over huge chunks of territory and spread communism many places around the world, it was falling apart, going bankrupt, and will be broken up into 15 separate countries. Now we go to the civil rights movement. The strange things about the Cold War and the civil rights movement is a lot of these things are happening simultaneously. Now, if we remember Jim Crow, the Jim Crow laws and the Jim Crow South were this laws and culture that kept African Americans second class. These very discriminatory and based on segregation laws made it impossible for many African Americans to succeed throughout the South. Now, there are many leaders of this movement. We've got to remember it's not just African Americans fighting for their rights. We'll also have members of the Chicano movement, the American Indian movement, the gay rights movement, the environmentalist movement, the feminist movement. There are many different people fighting for their rights and freedoms, and that word, egalitarianism, equality in America. Just some of the most famous, Cesar Chavez. Remember, he fought for the Chicano movement, fighting for Hispanic Americans, specifically for migrant workers. The other part of that Chicano movement, Jose Angel Gutierrez, he fought for bilingual education and the rights of students in this Hispanic community. Rosa Parks, big part of protesting segregation on public transport, and Martin Luther King Jr. I think we all remember his I Have a Dream speech and how he is the face of this movement. Now, on the opposite side of Dr. King, who believed in peace and nonviolence, we have groups like the Black Panthers, who are much more aggressive, wanting to fight for black equality and black empowerment, but are willing to be more aggressive and kind of in your face and not so nonviolent about it. The feminist movement, remember, women are fighting for the second wave of feminism. It's more about equality in the workplace and equality of opportunities in education, whereas the first wave of feminism was about women's right to vote. One of the common vocab words of this time period, civil disobedience. Remember, these are protests that, yes, you're breaking rules, but you're not really doing any violence. Examples would be like the sit-ins we see here, where kids are just sitting at the wrong place at the lunch counter, protesting segregation, or the Freedom Riders, those kids who rode buses up and down the country in desegregated buses when it was illegal. And the two most important civil rights laws to come out of this time period, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made segregation and discrimination illegal, basically saying that in the public of the United States, if you own or operate a business, if you operate a governmental organization or an educational institution, you cannot segregate and you cannot discriminate. And Voting Rights Act of 1965. This increased the voting ability for Black Americans by getting rid of the poll taxes in the South, getting rid of the literacy tests, and ensuring that the government will make voting safe and secure for all its citizens. Let's jump to the decades. This is the part of the studies where I start telling you the things from the decades we've already covered that I haven't really gotten to say. Stuff from the 50s and the 60s and 70s. Now, this first one here, if you remember, Jonas Salk invented the polio vaccine. This happened in the 1950s, and he really saves the children of America because this was a disease that greatly affected children under the age of 5. Remember, people will come down to this part of the country following World War II. It is called the Sun Belt. I think we understand the joke. This is the part of America that gets the most sun. Now, the reason they're starting to move away from the major cities into what are called suburbs is for better economic opportunities and better housing. Fast forwarding all the way up to, sorry. Fast forwarding up to the 1970s, we have President Jimmy Carter. Y'all, probably the most famous thing he does is called the Camp David Accords. Remember, he brings together the leaders of Egypt and Israel to negotiate a peace deal. This is why many call him our peaceful president. What he's doing here is he's acting as a mediator. He's the man in the middle between these two countries. Now, under Jimmy Carter, we have some really difficult things going on in the country of Iran. We have the Iranian Revolution and the Iranian hostage crisis. The country of Iran decides to overthrow their Shah or their king and institute a new religious government. While doing that, they want to get rid of any American influence in the country. Y'all, this is why today we still consider Iran one of the top enemies of the United States. Now, when there are troubles in the Middle East, we begin to see troubles with oil and what's called petroleum. Remember, this is the fuel source that operates our world. Um, our cities run on. It's what's in the gas pumps. It's what our cars and our fleets of trucks run on. And when there is an oil embargo, that is when countries who have the oil decide not to sell it to the United States. Many times, it's for our support of the country of Israel. Or if there's ever difficulty in the Middle East, it can disrupt flow of this stuff, of this oil and this natural resource. Y'all, this is what is called a gas line. People in the 1970s during the oil and gas crisis were waiting in these lines for hours, hoping to get gas before their cars ran out. Into the 1980s, we have some, sticking on the subject of oil, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. In the 1980s, we had this unique moment where the United States assisted what were called the Mujahideen, soldiers of Afghanistan. Now, the weird part about this story is that one of those soldiers was this man, Osama bin Laden, who one day would become the terrorist responsible for the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Fast forwarding into the 2000s, we have here the city of New Orleans. Remember the tragic event that takes place in New Orleans in the early 2000s is called Hurricane Katrina. The reason this hurricane is so bad for the city of New Orleans is that the city is built below sea level. So when the dams and levees that keep the water back are broken during the intense hurricane storm, the water fills into the city like a bowl and drowns the city, causing huge amounts of damage and loss of life. All right. Now, these were kind of the big moments from the decades. I did one for decade, one 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and the 2000s. Now, there are other moments that you should remember, and there are many other things. Look back at um my review topics, especially the decades review on Canvas. What I want to do now is I want to give you information about the different presidents you're going to see. A big part of understanding the second half of U.S. history is understanding the presidents that we get post World War II. After our long-standing president of Dwight D. Eisenhower, we get a whole bunch of different presidents. After Franklin D. Roosevelt, we get Harry S. Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower and JFK. But the presidents I often see the most on the STAR test are the ones following the death of JFK. So Lyndon B. Johnson, remember, he takes over after JFK is killed. He's a Southern Democrat. Remember why that's important. Southern Democrats were the ones who were against the civil rights movement. So what is so surprising about Lyndon B. Johnson as president is that he passes very important civil rights laws despite being a Southern Democrat from Texas. Richard Nixon. Now, he takes over and has a very unique presidency because he does good and bad. Y'all remember the good things he does, like creating the EPA and being good for the environment, de-escalating the Cold War. Remember the key vocabulary word détente. But of course, the image that is iconic that you see on the screen, and the thing that most people know him for, is that he will be forcibly removed from office because of the Watergate scandal. Rather than being impeached or prosecuted for crimes, he simply resigns and leaves being president of the United States, making people start doubting and mistrusting the government more and more. Now, Jimmy Carter, you might notice that I skipped a president. I'll be honest, the president of Gerald Ford, the man who takes over for Richard Nixon and fills in the rest of his time in office, he just never seems to come up on tests, so I wanted to kind of skip ahead. Jimmy Carter, known as the peaceful president. The biggest thing that happens under Jimmy Carter is the Camp David Accords. It's why he gets this nickname of the peaceful president, bringing peace and acting as a mediator for these two countries and kind of bringing some tranquility to this part of the world during this time. But also remember, he's a one-term president because bad things do happen while he's in office. There's a gas crisis causing huge amounts of inflation. The price of everything is just going up and up and up and skyrocketing. And we lose relationship with the country of Iran and they become an enemy of the United States. Now, in the 80s, of course, we get the Republicans' Republican Ronald Reagan. What you need to remember is that this guy kind of demonstrates what Republicans are um, supposed to believe in. The lowering of taxes, the being hands off with business and laissez-faire with business, and then what he institutes as kind of this new Republican idea is the building up and the spending on military budgets. He will begin spending more money on the military than any other president, and since him, the military budget has gone up and up and up. His idea is called peace through strength. He thinks he can bring an end to the Cold War and an end to communism in the world if America is the strongest military on earth. Now, technically, by the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, the Cold War will be done. Probably one of the most famous things of Ronald Reagan is trickle-down economics. Remember this idea of giving a tax break to the guy at the top of the economy and the benefits could trickle down to everybody else. Give a benefit to somebody who creates jobs like the Walmart Corporation. And maybe with the extra money, they hire new people, they build a new store, they sell to more customers, and everybody in society benefits. However, sometimes trickle-down economics doesn't work and the rich companies simply get a tax break and increase their profits. George H.W. Bush, probably the most famous thing or the only thing that they'll bring up with his time in office is called the Gulf War. This is also known as Operation Desert Storm, and it's the first time we ever go to war with the country of Iraq in the Middle East. Now, that war was a very short war because we were so easily victorious. Compare that to the war where we go back to Iraq in the 2000s, where we will be there for almost 20 years. Now, the president of the 1990s is Bill Clinton. He has what's called a surplus budget. Basically, he is in office during a time of great economic prosperity, and they are taking in so much taxpayer dollars that they actually have more money than they need to run the government. This is a rare thing because most governments run on what's called a deficit, meaning they actually add to the debt and don't have enough money to operate the government. But of course, the thing that most people remember this president for is his White House scandal and the awkward moment in which he was almost impeached and removed, but he was not removed from office. Simply, it goes down in history as an awkward, cringy moment of his presidency. Now, George W. Bush Jr., he's the son of the first George W. Bush. Now, he wins a very controversial election in the year 2000, where a third party candidate actually was involved and actually took some votes away, and there were multiple recounts. So it just goes to show this man was very close to not being president. Now, he's president during 9/11, during Hurricane Katrina. He will be the president that sends troops into Afghanistan in what he calls the War on Terror. This was supposed to be in reaction to 9/11, the terrorist attacks that hurt our country, and then the invasion of Iraq. The justification for going into Iraq a second time was that were searching for weapons of mass destruction. And then we end with Barack Obama. He is the two-term president and the first minority or African American president in American history. Now, his big topic is going to be called the Affordable Care Act. The concept is he wants to make health care in the United States affordable for as many Americans as possible. Now, also during his time period, there will be a giant housing market crisis, causing housing prices to plummet and foreclosures to skyrocket, also sending the country into what is called a recession. Remember, this is not quite as bad as what we call a depression when the economy and the stock market are, in a free fall, but a recession is a bad economic time, causing many Americans to have to struggle to survive. All right. Good job, everyone. If you paid attention this whole time, you have a much better chance of doing well on the STAR test for the second half of the year and the end of the year final exam. Again, go back to Canvas and look at all my extras, especially the decades STAR review. That just will remind you anything from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s I didn't get a chance to mention. All right. It's my number one concern when I send you all out that you come back to me safe and sound. Be safe, be smart, and study up. Bye, all.